Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And today's guest is Mark Bennett, who's the executive chairman at S2 Resources, an Australian-owned company that aims to discover and develop high-value mineral resources, mainly gold and base metals, in the political stable jurisdictions such as Australia and in Europe. Mark is a geologist with over 30 years' experience in gold, nickel, and base metals exploration, predominantly in Australia, West Africa, Canada, and Europe. And he's worked his way into executive positions over the last sort of 15 years. Mark has also been 2 times winner of the Association of Mining and Exploration Companies Prospector Award for the discoveries which include the Thunderbox Gold Mine, Waterloo Nickel Mine, and most recently the world-class Nova-Bollinger Nickel Copper Project mine. Today he's going to give us an overview of S2 Resources, the projects they're currently working on, and also talk about culture and strategy, which I know is a strong passion of Mark's. He's also going to be attending the upcoming IMARC conference in Sydney on the 29th to 31st of October at the Sydney Convention Centre. So there's a link below in the show notes to get your discounted tickets to go to obviously the conference. So then you can obviously meet Mark and other like-minded mining professionals at the event. So be sure to click on the link below and get your tickets as soon as possible. Mark, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you as well. Good to have you on the podcast. And as we always start these podcasts off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your career, how you got into mining, how your career developed. Obviously, you've been in the industry for a long time, and you're a geologist by background. But I just want to give our audience an overview of yourself.
Yeah, sure. Without sort of going on for too long, I grew up in sunny Birmingham. For some reason, liked rocks from an early age. I ended up getting into uni at Leicester University without all the right qualifications. So one of the tutors sort of took a risk and let me in, and got my degree. Went to Australia to work for a year on a visa. Then there was a bust, so I came home, did a PhD at the University of Leeds to keep my hand in. Then did a few sort of oil contracts and radioactive waste disposal contracts in the UK. Then conned my way back into Australia, got a job as a geologist with Western Mining Corporation. And then spent the next couple of decades doing exploration, mainly for base metals and gold, mainly Australia and a bit in West Africa. In the end, for various reasons, thought I'd try and do it on my own rather than just as an employee, and set up a company called Sirius Resources in a sort of Hollywood-style twisted plot. Just before the company ran out of money, we made a big nickel copper discovery called Nova, which made our little company, the best performing stock on the ASX in that year. And that was taken over by IGO for $1.8 billion. And as part of that deal, I spun out S2 Resources, the current company, and we set about with the same bunch of people going out and exploring for deposits once more to try and do it all over again. And we're all slightly crazy. We just keep on doing what is almost impossible, and being stupid enough to keep on trying. So hopefully we'll succeed again.
Yeah, fingers crossed, and I'm sure you will. I just want to go back to your career and graduation. I get a lot of graduates listen to this podcast, and I get a lot of graduates approach me, especially during their graduation or when they've just finished. You mentioned obviously you graduated and you went to Australia. At that particular time, how difficult was it to get to Australia? And were Australian companies open for a lot of UK graduates was there opportunities for you guys to go out there? And again, what was the process for you in deciding to go to Australia? And the reason why I ask this because I get a lot of graduates approach me and they're unsure as to what to do, and I just wonder if you can maybe give a little bit of advice from your experience in the past.
Yeah, sure. It's a funny story, actually. The industry goes in cycles. So there are times when geologists are in high demand. There aren't enough geologists in Australia where I live now. And so there's a lot of overseas geos, particularly from the UK, come and get jobs. But there are other times when there are none. And I just happen to be out of sync with cycles. And I'd been applying for lots of jobs and there were no jobs. Independently, I was applying for a residence visa for Australia. And you had to pay, I think at the time, £200 just to get the forms. So it was like a filtering process. It was the people who really wanted it that would sort of actually go to the next level, if you like. So I did that. I ran out of contracts. I was actually on the dole for a while and running out of money. And one day in the post came 2 letters. One was my residency visa for Australia, and there was a letter from WMC saying, sorry, there are no jobs, but if you just happen to be passing through Adelaide, call in and we'll give you an interview. I thought, okay, I'll call their bluff. I'd also been offered, the only job I could get was in South Africa, and this was during apartheid, and I didn't particularly want to go there. So I got a bank loan, a round the world ticket, called into Australia, and if I didn't get the job in Australia, I'd carry on to South Africa. And went to Adelaide, had the interview with the guy at WMC, and he said, look, really love to offer you a job, but there are no jobs. And as I was getting up to leave, the phone rang, and it was a geologist in Kalgoorlie resigning. And he said, no, you've got a job. And it was a real sliding door moment. And the sort of lesson I take from it for younger people is there's no certainty, but you've just got to put it out there. And by taking that risk and showing that you're prepared to do that to others will put you in good stead in the front of the queue when people are looking for people.
Yeah, I suppose it's like anything in life. There isn't certainty, but probability. And I suppose the more activities that you do, whether that's applying for jobs, whether that's getting in front of people, whether that's networking and meeting more and more people, you're increasing your probability of such events or such kind of events happening. And I suppose any graduates that are listening, just increase all kinds of activities if you are looking to get a job. And that doesn't even mean once you've graduated, that even can mean beforehand, whether you're in your second, third year, just going out and try and meet as many people as possible, because at a later date, you can reapproach those people and you never know what kind of a situation could develop from that, whether you're looking for a job or it could be a project that you could be JVing on. So, I suppose that's my little bit of advice.
Yeah, for sure. And there are a lot of smart people applying for jobs. And these days, as an employer looking for employees, one of the key attributes aside from it's hunger. So if somebody's passionate and hungry about it, they're going to, they've got a better chance of being good at it, not just clocking on 9 to 5.
Yeah, certainly. So I wonder if you can just give us an overview of S2 Resources.
Yeah, sure. So S2 sort of came about as a result of this takeover of Sirius, and basically all the Sirius shareholders got a shareholding in S2. So S2 started life with shareholders who already understood what we do, had already made money on their investment and understood the risk reward and the timelines and so on. So that gave us more license than a lot of small junior explorers. If you've got your shareholders behind you and then the board behind you, you can just sort of get on with it. And you can also be a bit more strategic. And because the previous company had made such a big discovery, those shareholders don't want us to just tickle around with small things. They want us to find big things. And to do so, you've got to have a bit more patience. So you need more time, more money, and you need to be strategic and therefore sort of quieter rather than jumping up and down, shouting about what you're doing all the time, necessarily. That sort of set the tone for S2. And what S2 does now is basically prowl around the world in sensible places, looking for things where we think there's a chance of finding something big. So we're predominantly in Australia, but we've been in Nevada, we've been in Sweden, we were in Finland, and we just sold our subsidiary there to a Vancouver listed company for $7 million. If we go there and test things and they don't shape up, we try and monetize them, and that then continues to fund the company at its main game. And in turn, that then keeps us away from going to raise money, which means that you're not diluting shareholders as much. So it's a sort of virtuous cycle, if you like.
So I wonder if you can just tell us some of the projects your company working on at the moment, a little bit about the projects, jurisdictions, etc.
Yeah. Probably our two headline projects. One is in the state of Victoria. It's around Agnico Eagle's gold mine at Fosterville, which is one of the richest gold mines in the world. And we actually got that ground through a tender process, and it was our ESG credentials that actually allowed us to beat out some much bigger rivals to get that ground. So we're literally surround Agnico Eagle, who are mining close to our boundaries, and our aim there is to find more gold from extensions of those structures. And then another one we have in New South Wales, which is not far from Newmont's big Cadia copper gold mine at Cadia near Orange. And we're looking for deeply buried giant porphyry style deposits there. So the first hole we drilled there, for example, was 1.3 kilometres deep. So it's the sort of big, high risk, high reward stuff with big, bold targets that a lot of companies don't have the ability to do, although they'd like to. So that's the sort of things we're doing.
Yeah. And when you're obviously looking at projects, and you probably come across so many projects across your desk every day, is there a particular criteria that you're looking for to then at least then start looking at them more seriously?
Yeah, several things. Obviously, technically, if we think it's got the potential to be something sizable, firstly, and that it hasn't already been sort of given a good shape by somebody else for one reason or another, so that there's the sort of opportunity there to find something big. Secondly, that it's in a country or a state that's stable and relatively mining friendly, because tend to be a lot of the bigger technical opportunities are in dodgier places, and it might be easier to find something, but it's harder to hang on to it once you've found it. And I think thirdly, just being in an area where the locals, whether they be traditional owners or just local communities, are sort of okay with you being there and okay with the concept of a mine potentially happening.
Okay. I know culture is really a passionate of yours. Why do you think culture is important to any organisation, whether it's small or large? And how does a culture develop in your experience within an organisation?
Yeah, I started life in a big company, and they can be fairly bureaucratic and hierarchical and sort of command and control type structures. And then sort of as my career progressed, I took my chances and moved down the food chain into smaller companies, initially sort of medium-sized producers, then into explorers. And I think what I found along the way is the smaller the organisation, the easier it is to set a culture that you want, because you can't impose a culture on an existing sort of monolithic giant organisation because it's already cemented, if you like. But if in a smaller organisation you can set your own culture, and I think it's important because particularly in exploration, statistically you're going to fail 99 times out of 100. So it can be very dispiriting. It's a roller coaster of highs and lows emotionally. As you develop targets, you get excited, you test them, it looks good, and then there's a disappointment, and you just keep on having to come back and come back. So if you don't have a good culture, you just go crazy doing that. You've got to believe in what you're doing, and you have to be adaptive as well. So you need to be able to change strategy. And a lot of people focus on strategy, but it's culture that transcends everything else. I used to say culture trumped strategy, but there's too many connotations with that word now. I say transcends strategy. And culture's like the glue that sticks everything else together. So when things are going well, it's easy, but when things aren't going well, it's the culture that I think makes a difference. And if you've got a good culture, you can keep a good team together, they can all contribute, and there's various things that having the right culture enables, like being innovative, collaborating, and probably most importantly, being able to communicate openly. Because a lot of organisations you can't, or people won't communicate openly for fear of retribution one way or another. You can have meetings, but I find that most of the important stuff is what isn't said rather than what is said. So if you can have an open culture where people feel comfortable and trust one another enough to really truly say what they think, you can actually be quite innovative and deal with all those things and come up with new ideas. So being a small company as well, it's a lot easier to set the culture because you start from the top and then you sort of accrete a lot of other people with similar values around it. So it's much easier to make that culture permeate the entire organisation than it is coming into an organisation and trying to change it all. So, at Sirius and now S2, we've always had a culture of having fun at work, sometimes play cricket in the office, socialising together, not just working together, having quite vocal arguments about things, and even with your boss as well. And I like to tell people, you should be able to argue with your boss, and if your boss can't cope with that, then they shouldn't actually be your boss. So it's all that sort of stuff. And I know Google is probably a bit cliched with the way they run their offices and stuff, but that's much more of a culture that lends itself to creativity. And I think with exploration, a lot of it is about creativity. So you've got to have creative people. You can't take like strict mine site rules and put people in little boxes and expect them to carry on being creative.
Yeah, certainly. You mentioned strategy. How does culture and strategy interact with each other within a company? And obviously you mentioned both need to be, I suppose, in parallel to work well, or for a company to work well.
Yeah. I think a lot of people mistakenly think strategy is the main thing, but I don't think it is. Strategy can change. Strategy can evolve over time, or companies can make conscious decisions to change their strategy. And also, as soon as you put a strategy in place, something unexpected happens and it veers off your expected course. So you have to get tactical instead of strategic. And you also need to be opportunistic as unexpected opportunities arise as well. So you've got to have an overarching strategy. You've got to be able to be tactical and you've got to be able to be opportunistic. And unless you have the culture that allows that to happen, it's very difficult to respond to those things and to flex. Some companies do it well, some companies don't. And my favourite example of a company where the culture sort of overrode the strategy and determined the strategy is actually 3M, the company that most people know for its stationery products and things like that. Because 3M started out as the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, and they were mining corundum to make sandpaper, and they weren't making much money from it. So they decided to make sort of products from that material, and then the product line expanded exponentially, because what they did is, and this is over 70 years ago, they said, okay, to all their employees, you can have 1 day a week. We'll pay you for 5 days a week. You'll do what we tell you to do for 4 days a week, but 1 day a week, do whatever you want and come up with ideas. And it was that culture that gave people that freedom to think and come up with ideas that sort of led to a product range that's in excess of 60,000 products now, I think. So even way back then, 70 years ago, the culture of the people running 3M sort of set in train the ingredients to allow them to become what they've become. If they hadn't have had that culture and given their employees that sort of freedom, then they wouldn't be a Fortune 500 now.
Yeah. That's obviously a good example. And obviously there's good examples and bad examples. What do you see, I suppose, in most common mining companies? And I suppose you are in the exploration space now. What are some mining companies doing good and doing bad from a culture perspective?
I think these days, most mining companies are trying to show the world and select employees who are sort of aligned with their values, and the values are more and more sort of inclusivity, sustainability, responsibility and things like that. So those cultural things are all good. But I also think that, unfortunately, the bigger the company and the more hierarchical it has to necessarily be, the more rules and regulations and the less rule there is for sort of individual freedoms, the harder it is to maintain a creative culture. You know, I'm not suggesting these days, but back in the early 2000s, BHP was an example of a really bad culture, I think, because the CEO at the time had a particular worldview and he decided to impose a whole bunch of rules on everybody within the company, which included not having their own desk. Each day they'd have to come to work and find a new desk. If they left anything on their desk at night, it would just be thrown in the bin. They weren't allowed to eat in the office and things like this. And he actually explicitly said that, you know, you're at work, you shouldn't feel comfortable here. It's not a place where you feel like you should nest, which to me is just insanely stupid, because you spend most of your life at work. You want to feel comfortable there and enjoy being there. And if you're saying that to people, I don't see how you're going to get good performance out of people.
Yeah, no, that's an example of a bad culture. And I suppose from what you just said, that's a little bit inhumane. And I suppose you're treating people like robots and commodities, which I suppose in a company people are commodities. But yeah, that is an example of a bad culture, which obviously you alluded to. So what do you see in the market at the moment? What good cultures, or maybe whether it's examples, what would you like to see more companies doing in terms of culture with their employees and how they're reacting with each other?
I think, you know, flexible as far as circumstances allow, flexible work times, open plan offices. I'm not a fan of the current trend of people working from home more and more, because, you know, I've lived both worlds, and I find the being in the same building, having face-to-face meetings is so much more productive than being on Zooms. The communication is just much more fluid, and, you know, chatting about informal things with no particular objective over a cup of coffee or out to lunch or in the pub after work, half the good things happen during those conversations rather than the sort of staged things. So I know a lot of people would prefer to work from home, but I don't think that is a good thing in terms of roles that require a lot of sort of cross-fertilisation and interaction and things like that. But that doesn't mean you have to be totally rigid. Our workplaces, people come in and out when they want. They're not sort of logged for the hours they do. It's what they produce at the end of the day. So it's about quality, not quantity. People would come in shorts and T-shirts. In Sirius, when we went from a $5 million company to a plus $1 billion company, people thought we would go back from our cheap and cheerful office out in the suburbs into some ritzy place in Perth, but we didn't. And the bankers in their suits had to come to us rather than us go to them. And having an office outside of the city was good because people weren't fighting rush hour traffic or paying for parking spaces and little things like that. So, you know, a lot of social things as well. And for our geologists, we actually, when we can, we do what we call a geotour. So every couple of years we'll take 2 weeks out and we'll all go on a tour to somewhere. We've been to the UK, New Zealand, Tenerife, looking at rocks. But you're all in a sort of big brother pressure cooker situation for 2 weeks, and you learn a lot more about one another during those periods than you do when you're just in the office. So, and people use their own leave time for that, but the company pays all the expenses. So it's a two-way street. And I've found that, for example, people prefer that to getting a pay rise, because if you get a pay rise, you lose half of it in tax and you don't really notice it that much, whereas 2 weeks doing that at no cost is worth more than a pay rise, and it gives you sort of memories that will stay with you forever.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of golden nuggets that you gave there. So hopefully anyone listening to this episode, hopefully may take on board and just think about some of the things that current practices that they're currently undertaking, and maybe whether they can tweak them based on some of the things that you've just said. And I like that 2 weeks away, and like you said, I suppose you are still partly working, but you're educating yourself in what you're doing, obviously, as a geologist. So no, they're a couple of great initiatives, and hopefully our listeners will take that on board and maybe implement something different than they're currently doing in their work. You mentioned regulations earlier. What, in terms of external expectation regulations, has changed in the last 20?
Obviously, what's now called ESG, environment, social governance, things have come to the fore, quite rightly. It went through a phase where we talked about the triple bottom line, and then it became sustainable stuff. And then that got bad connotations to it as well. It's really all about getting people to accept us as explorers and potentially miners being there, that we're not going to damage the environment, that we're not going to destroy communities, and that we're going to do things in a proper way that sort of benefits all stakeholders. I think the company's come a lot. The industry has come along in leaps and bounds in the last 20 years with that. Now, some of it has been voluntary, some of it has been imposed. So if you go back to, like in Australia, pre-native title days, companies just did what they want and had no regard for traditional owners, and I don't think people even knew the word then. And with the Mabo case and the establishment of native title, and then leading on from that, the need to ensure that sort of Aboriginal heritage is recognised and conserved, that sort of put a lot of pressures on the industry. And initially people didn't like it, and they did it grudgingly, but now it's just a normal part of doing business. And it's a good thing, because companies now routinely show that they can do it in a way which is beneficial to both sides. But it does create a cost, and I have great relationships with a number of Aboriginal groups, and one Aboriginal person in particular I've become sort of sufficiently close to that he's sort of made me his brother in Aboriginal custom, if you like. So I've got a fairly good insight into it, and most Aboriginal people like having explorers and miners to work with, because it ultimately gives economic benefits for them, and they need economic empowerment. But you get other people involved in the process that sort of derail it. And one trend that's happening right now is companies, before they go and explore, they need to do a heritage survey to ensure they're not going to disturb any sites, which is fine. But the cost of doing a heritage survey has probably gone from about $50,000 10 years ago to, in some instances, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. That's just to get clearance to go on the ground. And in some cases, the cost of doing that is actually exceeding the cost of the drilling program. So it's making things almost impossible for the smaller companies to actually do stuff. And it's usually the smaller companies who make the discoveries that the bigger companies gobble up. So there's a risk there that might start drying up the source of new projects and ultimately commodities. And likewise, I think in the general community, there's a growing sort of thing in NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So everybody wants, in particular, critical minerals and green minerals and stuff like that, providing it's in somebody else's backyard. And there's a noticeable increase in sort of activism on that front and community coercion almost. So if you go into an area and you're talking to people where you want to explore, and they might be, farmers, for example, and they'll be all for it, but then the tables will gradually turn, and it's people in that district who are putting pressure on those who are seen as collaborators almost, that are forcing their hand. So it's making it harder and harder to access areas to even explore. And I reckon these days probably 20% of our time is spent doing the stuff required just to get to the start line. And that will have an effect, but the effect will be very opaque, if you like, and there'll be a long lag time in terms of seeing the effect of that on what happens to new mines and so on. And the tragedy is that, you know, exploration and mining companies want to do things the right way. They want to ensure all the stakeholders are heard and rewarded and that nothing bad happens. But it's just getting harder and harder to actually operate like that. And the places where you can do so are getting fewer and fewer as well. So the irony will be, I think, that in 10 or 15 years' time, the people who most want a lower carbon emission future are going to find that the prices of commodities to create that are just astronomical because none of them are being mined anymore.
Yeah. Is there any other sort of regulations that you want to discuss that is affecting our industry in general? And I suppose you're a smaller explorer, and also with all these certain regulations coming into effect, whatever they are, what are the good and bad aspects of certain regulations that you've seen that are affecting the junior exploration space?
I think, you know, a lot of the environmental regulations that are coming are good. You may have to do a flora and fauna survey before you start work to ensure you're not disrupting some population of flowers or animals, and that's a good thing. And interestingly, what's happened over the last 20 years with that is the explorers who go out and do these surveys will actually find rare species of plants, usually, and find so many of them that they're not rare anymore and they're actually struck off the rare list. So it's the explorers who are actually doing the government's work, and usually they leave those places better than they've found them. So, you know, it's a cost for sure, but it's a good thing and it's the right thing to do. Same with heritage surveys with traditional owners. That's the right thing to do. One of the big problems, though, is once an Aboriginal group forms a body corporate to manage their areas and the benefits that might be coming in from a mining operation, for example, you get a lot of urban-dwelling lawyers and accountants who aren't Aboriginal involved, who come in and manage the thing, and the overhead cost of those guys takes more than just the cream off the income stream that would otherwise be due to the Aboriginal people. So that's one of the bad things about it. And I know a specific case where that's been happening. And, you know, the traditional owners, the actual Aboriginal people, are great guys, you get on with them. But when you try and negotiate an agreement, you can't actually get anywhere because of the lawyers and the accountants getting in the middle. And I think that they must all be paid by the hour.
More than likely. And whether I get any comments from lawyers when this episode goes out, maybe, or yourself may get some comments. Yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from. You're going to be attending the IMARC conference on the 29th to 31st of October, and you're going to be on a panel, or you're going to be speaking. I just wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about what you're going to be speaking about at the.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the sessions is all about how mining companies engage with traditional owners to work with them to get access to their land, to develop projects, and how that can be done in a sort of mutually beneficial way. And a lot of this stuff starts off fairly tense because you don't know one another. A lot of people have never even met an Aboriginal person face to face, and there's lots of preconceptions and so on. But once you start to engage and earn one another's trust and respect, it becomes a lot easier. I actually met a guy a long time ago just on a tourist thing near Kalgoorlie, and then 15 years later I bumped into him again in an entirely different circumstance. And he's an Aboriginal guy. He's a guy called Tony Shaw. He's a member of the Stolen Generation, but rather than bearing a grudge, he wants to do everything positive. I think he had 15 separate foster homes before he was 18. So he's got every reason to be bitter and twisted, but he makes it all about reconciling. He says it's not reconciliation because we were never together in the first place. It's conciliation. He's got his own company that does this, and we've worked together on a deal with my previous company, Sirius Resources, to put together a deal with the Naju people near Norseman in Western Australia has got a whole range of really great benefits for them, and they are benefiting from that right now. And then he's worked with other companies to do similar things, and it's all about understanding different cultural perspectives and sitting down and listening. We'll be doing a session in that theme. The way it's been organised is I'm meant to be interviewing him, but it will be much more informal than that. He likes to sort of do this stuff under the disguise of humour so that it sort of warms people up to it. So it'll probably be like a little comedy show with him being the funny man and me being the straight guy.
And that's more of a reason to purchase a ticket to come and obviously see yourself and other mining professionals at the event. Lastly, what's the outlook for S2 Resources sort of over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, we're busy exploring at those two projects I mentioned earlier around the Fosterville Gold Mine in Victoria and the Acadia in New South Wales for gold and copper. We've got a couple of other projects that are the earlier stage that we're working up, doing the sort of boring legwork on, so that'll be happening. And basically we just keep a pipeline of new opportunities coming to get to the drill stage, go in and drill test them. What we don't do is get overly in love with any one project and end up spending too long and too much money on diminishing returns. So we're quite surgical about it, and we'll keep on cycling through that. And when that question gets asked to a lot of CEOs of junior explorers, they'll give you very sort of flowery answers, but I sort of take a completely opposite approach to that, and a sort of brutally honest approach, which actually appeals to most of our investors. And when they ask, what's next, I say, we'll keep on failing until we succeed.
Yeah, and that's a great sentence to finish off with. Mark, really appreciate your time. Thank you for giving us an overview of S2 Resources and your views around culture and strategy, and some of the things that you've seen in our industry, and some of the things that you've implemented in your organisation to help, I suppose, foster a better culture and hopefully for companies to succeed more than they're currently doing. So thank you for your time. If our audience wants to reach out to you, if they want to follow your story, follow the company, and also obviously potentially meet you at the IMARC conference, how can they go about doing that, and what social media platform channels are you on?
Yeah, I'm not much of a social media person other than LinkedIn. I can't help myself. Every now and again I'll put a few things up on LinkedIn just to stir the pot a bit, so people can contact me through LinkedIn or through my company email, which is mark.bennett@s2resources.com.au.
Great. We'll include those in the show notes, accompany this anyway, for easy access. So again, thank you for your time, Mark. Maybe you want to come on the podcast sometime next year again, give us an update on any projects that you're involved in.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. And as mentioned in the introduction, Mark is going to be at the IMARC conference on the 29th to the 31st of October. So please get your tickets. If you look at the show notes accompanying this, there is a discount code to get cheaper tickets. And hopefully you'll be able to see Mark and other like-minded professionals at the conference. And I'm sure it's going to be a great event. So thank you for listening. And until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.